Excuse me. Let me start over. All children, except one, grow up. They soon knew that they'll grow up, and the way Wendy knew was this. One day when she was 2 years old, she was playing in a garden, and she plucked another flower and ran with it to her mother. I suppose she must have looked rather delightful, for Mrs. Darling put her hand to her heart and cried, "Oh, why can't you remain like this forever?" This was all that passed between them on the subject, but henceforth Wendy knew that she must grow up. You always know after you're two. Two is the beginning of the end. Of course, they lived at 14, and until Wendy came, her mother was the chief one. She was a lovely lady with a romantic mind and such a sweet, mocking mouth. Her romantic mind was like the tiny boxes, one within another, that come from the puzzling East. However many you discover, there's always one more, and her sweet, mocking mouth had one kiss on it that Wendy could never get, though there it was, perfectly conspicuous in the right-hand corner. The way Mr. Darling had won her was this. The many gentlemen who had been boys when she was a girl discovered simultaneously that they loved her, and they all ran to her house to propose to her, except Mr. Darling, who took a cab and nipped in first, and so he got her. He got all of her except the innermost box and the kiss. He never knew about the box, and in time he gave up trying for the kiss. Wendy thought Napoleon could have got it, but I can picture him trying and then going off in a passion, slamming the door. Mr. Darling used to boast to Wendy that her mother not only loved him, but respected him. He was one of those deep ones who knows about stocks and shares. Of course, no one really knows, but he quite seemed to know, and he often said stocks were up and shares were down, in a way that would have made any woman respect him. Mrs. Darling was married in white, and at first she kept the books perfectly, almost gleefully, as if it were a game, not so much as a Brussels sprout was missing. But by and by whole cauliflowers dropped out, and instead of them there were pictures of babies without faces. She drew them when she should have been totting up. They were Mrs. Darling's guesses. Wendy came first, then John, then Michael. For a week or two after Wendy came, it was doubtful whether they'd be able to keep her, as she was another mouth to feed. Mr. Darling was frightfully proud of her, but he was very honorable, and he sat on the edge of Mrs. Darling's bed, holding her hand and calculating expenses, while she looked at him imploringly. She wanted to risk it, come what might, but that was not his way. His way was with a pencil and a piece of paper, and if she confused him with suggestions, he had to begin at the beginning again. "Now don't interrupt," he would beg of her. "I have £1.17 here, 2 and 6 at the office. I can cut off my coffee at the office. Say 10 shillings, making 2, 9 and 6, with your 8, 10 and 3, makes 397. 5 not, and my checkbook makes 897. Who's that moving? 897, dot carry 7. Don't speak, my own. And the pound you lent to the man who came to the door. Quiet, child. Dot and carry, child. There, you've done it. Did I say 997? Yes, I said 997. The question is, can we try it for a year on 997? Of course we can, George, she cried. But she was prejudiced in Wendy's favor, and he was really the grander character of the two. "Remember mumps," he warned her almost threateningly, and off he went again. "Mumps, £1, that's what I put down, but I dare say it'll be more like 30 shillings. Don't speak. Measles, 1.5, German measles, half a guinea, makes 2.15, 6. Don't waggle your finger. Whooping cough, say 15 shillings. And on it went, and it added up differently each time. But at last Wendy just got through, with mumps reduced to 12.6, and 2 kinds of measles treated as 1. There was the same excitement over John, and Michael had an even narrower squeak, but both were kept. And soon you might have seen the 3 of them going in a row to Miss Folsom's kindergarten school, accompanied by their nurse. Mrs. Darling loved to have everything just so, and Mr. Darling had a passion for being exactly like his neighbors, so of course they had a nurse. As they were poor, owing to the amount of milk the children drank, this nurse was a prim Newfoundland dog called Nana, who had belonged to no one in particular until the Darlings engaged her. She had always thought children important, however, and the Darlings had become acquainted with her in Kensington Gardens, where she spent most of her spare time peeping into perambulators, and was much hated by careless nursemaids, whom she followed to their homes and complained of to their mistresses. She proved to be quite a treasure of a nurse. How thorough she was at bath time, and up at any moment of the night if any of her charges made the slightest cry. Of course, her kennel was in the nursery. She had a genius for knowing when a cough is a thing to have no patience with, and when it needs stocking round your throat. She believed to her last day in old-fashioned remedies like rhubarb leaf, and made sounds of contempt over all of this newfangled talk about germs and so on. It was a lesson in propriety to see her escorting the children to school, walking sedately by their side when they were well behaved, and butting them back into line if they strayed. On John's footer days, she never once forgot his sweater, and she usually carried an umbrella in her mouth in case of rain. There's a room in the basement of Miss Folsom's school where the nurses wait. They sat on forms while Nana lay on the floor, but that was the only difference. They affected to ignore her as of inferior social status to themselves, and she despised their light talk. She resented visits to the nursery from Mrs. Darling's friends, but if they did come, she first whipped off Michael's pinafore and put him in one with blue braiding, and smoothed out Wendy and made a dash at John's hair. No nursery could possibly have been conducted more correctly, and Mr. Darling knew it, yet he sometimes wondered uneasily whether the neighbors talked. He had his position in the city to consider. Nana also troubled him in another way. He had sometimes a feeling that she did not admire him. "I know she admires you tremendously, George," Mrs. Darling would assure him, and then she would sign to the children to be especially nice to father. Lovely dances followed, in which the only other servant, Liza, was sometimes allowed to join. Such a midget she looked in her long skirt and maid's cap, though she had sworn when engaged that she would never see 10 again. The gaiety of those romps, and gayest of all was Mrs. Darling, who would pirouette so wildly that all you could see of her was the kiss, and then if you had dashed at her you might have got it. There never was a simply happier family, until the coming of Peter Pan. Mrs. Darling first heard of Peter when she was tidying up her children's minds. It is the nightly custom of every good mother, after her children are asleep, to rummage in their mind and put things straight for next morning, repacking into their proper places the many articles that have wandered during the day. If you could keep awake, but of course you can't, you would see your own mother doing this, and you would find it very interesting to watch her. It's quite like tidying up drawers. You would see her on her knees, I expect, lingering humorously over some of your contents, wondering where on earth you had picked this thing up, making discoveries sweet and not so sweet, pressing this to her cheek as if it were nice as a kitten, and hurriedly stowing that out of sight. When you wake in the morning, the naughtiness and evil passions with which you went to bed have been folded up small and placed at the bottom of your mind, and on the top, beautifully aired and spread out your prettier thoughts, ready for you to put on. I don't know whether you've ever seen a map of a person's mind. Doctors sometimes draw maps of other parts of you, and your own map can become intensely interesting. But catch them trying to draw a map of a child's mind, which is not only confused, but keeps going round all the time. There's zigzag lines on it, just like the temperature on a card, and these are probably roads in the island, for the Neverland is always more or less an island, with astonishing splashes of color here and there, and coral reefs and rakish-looking craft in the offing, and savages in lonely lairs, and gnomes who are mostly tailors, and caves through which a river runs, and princes with 6 elder brothers, and a hut fast going to decay, and one very small old lady with a hooked nose. It would be an easy map if that were all, but there's also first day at school, religion, fathers, the round pond, needlework, murders, hangings, verbs that take the dative, chocolate pudding day, getting into braces, say 99, 3 pence for pulling out your tooth yourself, and so on. And either these are part of the island, or they're another map showing through. It is all rather confusing, especially as nothing will stand still. Of course, the Neverlands vary a great deal. John's, for instance, had a lagoon with flamingos flying over it, at which John was shooting, while Michael, who is very small, had a flamingo with lagoons flying over it. John lived in a boat turned upside down on the sands, Michael in a wigwam, Wendy in a house of leaves deftly sewn together. John had no friends. Michael had friends at night. Wendy had a pet wolf forsaken by its parents, but on the whole, Neverlands have a family resemblance, and if they stood still in a row, you could say of all of them that they have each other's nose, and so forth. On these magic shores, children at play are forever beaching their coracles. We too have been there. We can still hear the sound of the surf, though we shall land no more. Of all delectable islands, the Neverland is the snuggest and most compact, Not large and sprawly, with tedious distances between one adventure and another, but nicely crammed. When you play at it by day with the chairs and tablecloth, it is not in the least alarming, but in the 2 minutes before you go to sleep, it becomes very nearly real. That is why there are night lights. Occasionally in her travels through her children's minds, Mrs. Darling found things she could not understand. And of these things, quite the most perplexing was the word Peter. She knew of no Peter, and yet he was here and there in John and Michael's minds, while Wendy began to be scrawled all over with him. The name stood out in bolder letters than any of the other words, and as Mrs. Darling gazed, she felt that it had an oddly cocky appearance. Yes, he is rather cocky, Wendy admitted with regret. Her mother had been questioning her. But who is he, my pet? He's Peter Pan, you know, Mother. At first, Mrs. Darling did not know, but after thinking back into her childhood, she just remembered a Peter Pan who was said to live with the fairies. There were odd stories about him, as that when children died, he went part of the way with them so that they should not be frightened. She had believed in him at the time, but now that she was married and full of sense, she quite doubted whether there was any such person. Besides, she said to Wendy, he'd be grown up by this time. Oh, no, he isn't grown up, Wendy assured her confidently, and he's just my size. She meant that he was her size in both mind and body. She didn't know how she knew it, she just knew it. Mrs. Darling consulted Mr. Darling, but he smiled pooh-pooh. Mark my words, he said, it's just some nonsense Nana's been putting into the head. Just the sort of ideas a dog would have. Leave it alone, it'll blow over. But it would not blow over, and soon the troublesome boy gave Mrs. Darling quite a shock. Children have the strangest adventures without being troubled by them. For instance, they may remember to mention, a week after the event has happened, that when they were in the wood they met their dead father and had a game with him. It was in this casual way that Wendy one morning made a disquieting revelation. Some leaves of a tree had been found on the nursery floor, which certainly were not there when the children went to bed, and Mrs. Darling was puzzling over them when Wendy said with a tolerant smile, "Oh, I do believe it's that Peter again." "Whatever do you mean, Wendy?" "It's so naughty of him not to wipe," Wendy said, sighing. She was a tidy child. She explained in quite a matter-of-fact way that she thought Peter sometimes came to the nursery in the night and sat on the foot of the bed and played his pipes to her. Unfortunately, she never woke, so she didn't know how she knew. She just knew. "What nonsense you talk, Precious. No one can get into the house without knocking." "I think he comes in by the window," she said. "My love, it's 3 floors up." "Were not the leaves at the foot of the window, Mother?" It was quite true. The leaves had been found very near the window. Mrs. Darling did not know what to think, for it all seemed so natural to Wendy that you could not dismiss it by saying that she had been dreaming. "My child," her mother cried, "why did you not tell me of this before?" "I forgot," said Wendy lightly. She was in a hurry to get her breakfast. Oh, surely she must have been dreaming. But, on the other hand, there were the leaves. Mrs. Darling examined them carefully. They were skeleton leaves, but she was sure they did not come from any tree that grew in England. She crawled about the floor, peering at it with a candle for marks of a strange foot. She rattled the poker up the chimney and tapped the walls. She let down a tape from the window to the pavement, and it was a sheer drop of 30 feet, without so much as a spout to climb up by. Certainly Wendy had been dreaming. But Wendy had not been dreaming, as the very next night showed, the night on which the extraordinary adventures of these children may be said to have begun. On the night we speak of, all the children were once more in bed. It happened to be Nana's evening off, and Mrs. Darling had bathed them and sung to them till one by one they had let go of her hand and slid away into the land of sleep. All were looking so safe and cozy that she smiled at her fears now and sat down tranquilly by the fire to sew. It was something for Michael, who on his birthday was getting into shirts. The fire was warm, however, and the nursery dimly lit by 3 night lights, and presently the sewing lay on Mrs. Darling's lap. Then her head nodded, oh, so gracefully. She was asleep. Look at the 4 of them, Wendy and Michael over there, John here, and Mrs. Darling by the fire. There should have been a 4th nightlight. While she slept, she had a dream. She dreamt that the Neverland had come too near, and that a strange boy had broken through from it. He did not alarm her, for she thought she had seen him before in the faces of many women who have no children. Perhaps he's to be found in the faces of some mothers also. But in her dream, he had rent the film that obscures the Neverland, and she saw Wendy and John and Michael peeping through the gap. The dream by itself would have been a trifle, but while she was dreaming, the window of the nursery blew open, and the boy did drop on the floor. He was accompanied by a strange light, no bigger than your fist, which darted about the room like a living thing, and I think it must have been this light that wakened Mrs. Darling. She started up with a cry and saw the boy, and somehow she knew at once he was Peter Pan. If you or I or Wendy had been there, we should have seen that he was very like Mrs. Darling's kiss. He was a lovely boy, clad in skeleton leaves and the juices that ooze out of trees, but the most entrancing thing about him was that he had all his first teeth. When he saw that she was a grown-up, he gnashed the little pearls at her. So that's all of that. That's the end of that chapter for now. So I'm going to jump ahead just to read a little more, as I said, because these are parts that are sometimes not always covered in adaptations, to part of the return home, which catches you back up to basically where you've just left Mr. and Mrs. Darling, to say what they've been doing during this time. And in between, you can just imagine all the things you're used to seeing from the movies and plays or whatever you've enjoyed. All of the adventures in Neverland with the crocodile, and Hook is defeated, and now Peter and the Lost Boys and Wendy and John and Michael are coming back from Neverland. But the parents don't know that yet. Okay. Here we go. Instead of watching the ship, we must now return to that desolate home from which 3 of our characters had taken heartless flight so long ago. It seems a shame to have neglected number 14 all this time, and yet we may be sure that Mrs. Darling does not blame us. If we'd returned sooner to look with sorrowful sympathy at her, she would probably have cried, "Don't be silly, what do I matter? Go back and keep an eye on the children." So long as mothers are like this, their children will take advantage of them, and they may lay to that. Even now we venture into that familiar nursery, only because its lawful occupants are on their way home. We're merely hurrying on in advance of them to see that their beds are properly aired, and that Mr. and Mrs. Darling do not go out for the evening. We are no more than servants. Why on earth their beds should be properly aired, seeing that they left them in such a thankless hurry? Would it not serve them jolly well right if they came back and found that their parents were spending the weekend in the country? It would be the moral lesson that they had been in need of ever since we met them. But if we contrived things in this way, Mrs. Darling would never forgive us. One thing I should like to do immensely, and that is to tell her, in the way authors have, that the children are coming back, that indeed they will be here on Thursday week. This would spoil so completely the surprise to which Wendy and John and Michael are looking forward. They've been planning it out on the ship. Mother's rapture, father's shout of joy, Nana's leap through the air to embrace them first, when what they ought to be preparing for is a good hiding. How delicious to spoil it all by breaking the news in advance, so that when they enter grandly, Mrs. Darling may not even offer Wendy her mouth, and Mr. Darling may exclaim pettishly, "Dash it all, here are those boys again." However, we should get no thanks even for this. We're beginning to know Mrs. Darling by this time, and may even be sure that she would upbraid us for depriving the children of their little pleasure. "But, my dear madam, it is 10 days till Thursday week, so that by telling you what's what, we can save you 10 days of unhappiness." "Yes, but at what a cost, by depriving the children of 10 minutes of delight." "Oh, you will look at it that way." "What other way is there in which to look at it? You see, the woman had no proper spirit. I'd meant to say extraordinarily nice things about her, but I despise her, and not one of them will I say now. She does not really need to be told to have things ready, for they are ready. All the beds are aired, and she never leaves the house. And observe, the window is open. For all the use we are to her, we might go back to the ship. However, we are here, we may as well stay and look on. That's all we are, lookers on. Nobody really wants us. So let us watch and say jaggy things, in the hope that some of them will hurt." The only change to be seen in the night nursery is that between 9 and 6, the kennel is no longer there. When the children flew away, Mr. Darling felt in his bones that all the blame was his for having chained Nana up, and that from first to last she had been wiser than he. Of course, if we have seen, he was quite a simple man. Indeed, he might have passed for a boy again if he'd been able to take his baldness off. But he had also a noble sense of justice, and a lion's courage to do what seemed right to him, and having thought the matter out with anxious care after the flight of the children, he went down on all fours and crawled into the kennel. To which Mrs. Darling's dear invitations to him to come out, he replied sadly but firmly, "No, my own one, this is the place for me." In the bitterness of his remorse, he swore he would never leave the kennel until his children came back. Of course, this was a pity, but whatever Mr. Darling did, he had to do in excess. Otherwise, he soon gave up doing it. And there never was a more humble man than the once proud George Darling, as he sat in the kennel of an evening, talking with his wife of their children and all their pretty ways. Very touching was his deference to Nana. He would not let her come into the kennel, but on all other matters he followed her wishes implicitly. Every morning the kennel was carried with Mr. Darling in it into a cab, which conveyed him to his office, and he returned home in the same way at 6. Something of the strength of character of the man will be seen if we remember how sensitive he was to the opinion of his neighbors. This man whose every movement now attracted surprised attention. Inwardly, he must have suffered torture, but he preserved a calm exterior even when the young criticized his little home, and he always lifted his hat courteously to any lady who looked inside. It may have been quite quixotic, but it was magnificent. Soon the inward meaning of it leaked out, and the great heart of the public was touched. Crowds followed the cab, cheering it lustily. Charming girls scaled it to get his autograph. Interviews appeared in the better class of papers, and society invited to dinner and added, "Do come in the kennel." On that evening, Thursday week, Mrs. Darling was in the night nursery awaiting George's return home, a very sad-eyed woman. Now that we look at her closely and remember the gaiety of her in the old days, all gone now just because she's lost her babes, I find I won't be able to say the nasty things about her after all. If she was too fond of her rubbishy children, she couldn't help it. Look at her in her chair, where she's fallen asleep. The corners of her mouth, where one looks first, it's almost withered up. Her hand moves restlessly on her breast, as if she had a pain there. Some like Peter best, and some like Wendy best, but I like her best. Suppose to make me happy, we whisper to her in her sleep that the brats are coming back. They're really within 2 miles of the window now and flying strong, but all we need whisper is that they are on their way. Let's. It's a pity that we did it, for she has started up, calling their names, and there's no one in the room but Nana. Oh, Nana, I dreamt my dear ones had come back. Nana had filmy eyes, but all she could do was put her paw gently on her mistress's lap, and they were sitting together thus when the kennel was brought back. As Mr. Darling puts his head out to kiss his wife, we see that his expression is more worn than of yore, but has a softer expression. He gave his cat to Liza, who took it scornfully, for she had no imagination and was quite incapable of understanding the motives of such a man. Outside, the crowd who had accompanied the cab home were still cheering, and he was naturally not unmoved. "Listen to them," he said. "It's very gratifying." "Lots of little boys," sneered Liza. "There were several adults today," he assured her with a faint flush, but when she tossed her head, he had not a word of reproof for her. Social success had not spoiled him, it had made him sweeter. For some time he had sat half outside the kennel, talking with Mrs. Darling of this success, and pressing her hand reassuringly, when she said he hoped his head would not be turned by it. "But if I had been a weak man," he said, "good heavens, if I had been a weak man." "And George," she said timidly, "you are as full of remorse as ever, aren't you?" "Full of remorse as ever, dearest. See my punishment, living in a kennel." "But it is punishment, isn't it, George? You're sure you're not enjoying it?" "My love!" You may be sure that she begged his pardon, and then, feeling drowsy, he curled round in the kennel. "Won't you play me to sleep?" he asked, on the nursery piano, and as he was crossing to the day nursery, he added thoughtlessly, "Shut that window. I feel a draft." "Oh, George, never ask me to do that. The window must always be left open for them. Always, always." Now it was his turn to beg her pardon, and she went into the day nursery and played, and soon he was asleep, and while he slept, Wendy and John and Michael flew into the room. Oh no. We have written it so because that was the charming arrangement planned by them when we left the ship. But something must have happened since then, for it was not they who have flown in. It is Peter and Tinker Bell. And that's all I'm going to read for now. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.